Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for July 1st, 2021. I'm going to be looking at two things today. One is the statements coming from Vladimir Putin yesterday in his annual call to the Russian people, and also the idiocy of the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill in the United States. Let's start with Putin, where he has an annual dialogue with the Russian people. It was over 3 hours and 42 minutes. There were over 2 million phone calls with questions, and he took 70 questions. Now, what he repeated a number of times, which is what's needed to be heard in the West, is that, and these are quotes, the world is changing dramatically. He said he's optimistic that the strategic situation will become more favorable with relations with the United States. And he cited both the promise and the problem with what came out of the Geneva conference. He said that there was a potential that came from there, and that the problem is that there are some who seek to preserve their monopoly position at any cost. And he said that's why there's destructive behavior. And among these behaviors, he included military exercises, provocations, and sanctions. But then he was explicit. The period of the unipolar world is gone. And this is similar to what the Chinese had said at the time of the Geneva conference, at the G7 summit and the NATO summit, that the day is long gone when a small group of countries can dictate policies to the rest of the world. In other words, both the Russians and the Chinese are on record as saying that they will not accept the idea of a rules-based order as a unipolar system where a small group of countries who style themselves as the democracies versus the authoritarian regimes will impose their will on the rest of the world. And what Putin said in response to this is that Russia is advancing, is moving in the right direction. It's increased its defense capability. And he also emphasized that in the face of the sanctions, the attacks on the Russian economy, economic sovereignty is increasing for Russia. And there are investments going into new technologies and into agriculture. But the Russian economy has still been severely damaged by these sanctions, but not to the point that they can't function. Then Putin turned to the question of what happened in the off the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea the other day, the incident in which the British ship, the HMS Defender, crossed into Russian territorial waters. He said this was a provocation, but he said it was not just the British, but also by the United States. And he cited the presence of U.S. reconnaissance planes tracking Russian forces. And he said their purpose was to see what countermeasures would be deployed by the Russians when the territorial integrity of the maritime area of Russia is brought under surveillance and attack. It was clear from everything that's been published that the British did do this intentionally to see what the response would be. And they did it as a further provocation to be able to say, see, the Russians claim Crimea, but we don't accept that. So what Putin was talking about in his discussion, his candid communication with the Russian people, is that Russia will not tolerate infringements on its sovereignty, that it's becoming stronger, that it has allies, and that he's hopeful that the spirit of Geneva, at the talks he had with Biden, will overcome these tendencies of the unipolar faction for war. It should be noted that one of the big supporters of U.S. unipolar dominance, Donald Rumsfeld, passed away yesterday. Rumsfeld was part of the group that pushed the Project for a New American Century doctrine that after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, only the United States and its immediate allies had the authority to dictate world policy. Now, let's turn to this whole question of the bipartisan infrastructure framework, which was agreed upon yesterday. EIR experts proclaim it to be incompetent and a farce, and here's why. First of all, what's not included in it? There's no mention of high-speed rail, which is an absolute necessity for the United States to advance to a modern transportation system. We have very little high-speed rail in the United States, far behind France, Japan, and especially China. Secondly, no consideration for nuclear energy or investment in fusion research. The future is dependent on increasing the energy flux density of our power generating systems. Solar and wind is the opposite. There have been advances made in nuclear fusion in recent years that put us on the doorstep, if we have international cooperation and enough investment, put us on the doorstep of virtually unlimited energy for the future. That's not even in the infrastructure project, so-called, of the United States. And then a third point of what's missing. If you look at a map of the United States with the rainfall and the amount of water available, the whole western part of the country is usually designated as red, not for Republican, but for bone dry, running out of water. Now, what's the solution to that? Major infrastructure, water development projects, desalination. In particular, one that the LaRouche movement has supported for years is the North American Water and Power Alliance, which would bring water down from Alaska and northwestern Canada through the Rocky Mountain Trench to the whole western states of the United States. This could have been done in the 1960s. It could have been done again when we revived it in the 1980s. But it hasn't been. It's not even in the planning vocabulary of the people who are complaining now about water and are saying that the solution is water conservation. Well, conservation's fine, but it doesn't produce more water. And what's needed now is a system that will ensure the water needs of the United States. Nowhere is that anywhere in the joint infrastructure plan of both parties. Now, our estimate is that over $21 trillion is needed over the next 10 years for minimal investment in a new platform of infrastructure. The bipartisan agreement is for $1.2 trillion over 8 years. And only $500 billion of that is new funding. Most of the rest of it is already incorporated in previous budgets. So instead of 21 trillion, a paltry figure less than 1 trillion over 8 years. Now that includes only $13.6 billion a year for all transportation infrastructure, which includes filling potholes and repairing bridges that are structurally deficient and so on. In 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers said you need 3 times that much. That is 3 times the $13.6 billion per year. Their actual estimate is that we have an infrastructure deficit of somewhere, or underfunding of somewhere close to 4 to 5 trillion. And then what does the bill include? Go green. And while there are elements of subsidies for solar and wind, more importantly is the attempt to shut down farming and economic activity to achieve the mythical net zero carbon status, which the climate conference from Paris and the subsequent conferences have concluded is necessary. Net zero carbon means net zero production. The move away from modern agriculture, modern industry, modern power production. The idea that at some point Americans will eat nothing but fake meat, sweat in their homes in the summer, freeze in the winter, and have nowhere to go because fossil fuel will be so expensive. This is the dystopia which is promised by this bipartisan bill. And it's not just the Democrats. Remember, it's bipartisan. The Republicans don't want to spend money on infrastructure. Donald Trump talked about modernizing American infrastructure, and he couldn't get McConnell, Paul Ryan, or any Republicans to support him on that. And I don't think he fought hard enough for it. He could have gone across to the Democrats and embarrassed them into making a deal. So we have a moment with a potential to shift the strategic situation, with growing opposition to the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. And that's what we have to operate on. We have to seize the initiative to mobilize a global anti-Malthusian resistance, to take the oligarchical plans, the plans for a neoliberal world order which is unlivable, and turn it into a century of human progress. That's the task for the LaRouche movement, and I hope you'll be willing to join us in accomplishing that. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.